system that allowed players to pledge their loyalty to one faction. A system that ingrained itself within the Destiny 1 player base. A system that no longer exists. What am I talking about? The faction system. For those who began playing Destiny in the time of Forsaken, you might have no idea about this forgotten bit of Destiny history. Introduced with Destiny 1 in 2014, I'm specifically talking about the Future War Cult, New Monarchy, and Dead Orbit factions. These three factions represented the best of what Destiny 1 had to offer. They showed that even small additions to a game could have a lasting impact on players' sentiment and nostalgia. The faction system that began in Destiny 1 paved the road throughout Destiny's lifecycle, and even into Destiny 2, shaped the core ideas that made vanilla Destiny 2 a flawed experience. Hi everyone, I'm Jonah, and today I'm going to lay out what the faction system had to offer players in Destiny 1, why it's remembered so fondly, and look at the failed faction system in Destiny 2, known as Faction Rallies. The videos I use are from YouTubers who spent time and effort to post videos on Destiny. Their channels will be in the description down below. Hope you enjoy the video. New Monarchy, Future War Cult, and Dead Orbit. These three names would start a small and fun clash between members of the Destiny community. In Destiny 1, scattered around the tower, there were three NPC vendors: Arak Jalal for the Dead Orbit, Lakshmi 2 for the Future War Cult, and Executor Hideo for the New Monarchy. When players interacted with each one of these vendors, there was the option to support that specific faction by pledging to them for 2,500 Glimmer. This was where the rivalry started. See, the catch was, once you pledged to a faction, you could only gain experience and gear from that specific faction. This meant for a large amount of Destiny players, once they chose a faction for the first time, they would defend that faction with their dying breath. They wouldn't actually die, I'm just being hyperbolic. Now there were players that would simply pick a faction for their favorite color for gear or weapons, but others, myself included, chose a faction and stuck with it out of loyalty. These factions, much like the Vanguard or Crucible, could be leveled up by simply completing activities throughout the game, and they could also be leveled up by giving motes of light or other resources to them in return for faction experience. As a reward for leveling your faction, you could gain exclusive weapons and armor, many of which were extremely powerful and a valid option for harder activities. Let's start out with the Future War Cult, my favorite faction, which carried great weapons such as the Whale, the Wounded, the Wormwood, and the Warpath. Dead Orbit had the iconic Hung Jury Scout Rifle, Last Ditch 001, Worlds to Come 001, and Unto Dust 00. Finally, for the New Monarchy, there was the Objection 4, Free Will 3, Impeacher 5, and the Bad Counsel 4. Keep in mind that I left out quite a few weapons, as these three vendors constantly had new weapons and were always updated for every expansion to keep them fresh and interesting. Every faction had great weapons and cool looking gear for players to chase, and since every faction had something good, there wasn't a need for players to have to change their factions to get the best weapons in the game. So why are factions, for the most part, fondly remembered by the Destiny community? I'll get into this later with faction rallies in Destiny 2, but in Destiny 1, this competition between factions was purely in the hands of the players. Factions weren't pushed on the player, and were something to be discovered in the game. They provided an incentive for every player to be attached to their own faction and defend it. Factions gave players another avenue to go down and get rewarded, and the passive progression that came with getting faction rank ups without needing to do anything specific felt satisfying. One of the greatest parts about factions was when you reached rank 25 with any of them, you would gain access to an exotic class item specific to your faction and class. This meant there were 9 exotic armor pieces tied to factions that rewarded players even more than simply giving them armor and weapons. These exotic class items gave players the option to proudly show off their loyalty for the faction they chose to level up. Before I move on to how factions were brought into Destiny 2, I should probably mention that while not confirmed, it was most likely that Dead Orbit was the most popular faction in Destiny 1, since it had all black shaders and especially in year 2 of Destiny 1, had the Hung Jury Scout Rifle. But particularly in Destiny 1's current state, aka the state that Rise of Iron left it, every faction has great gear and a community that supports it.
This is great. Anyone want a hug? No hugs.
Faction rallies were an event brought with the release of Destiny 2, and a replacement for the faction system that was in Destiny 1. This event took place over 1 week, about once a month, and involved the player completing activities, gaining tokens for a specific faction, and turning in those tokens for rewards. Everyone could decide on the faction they would pledge to that specific week, the options being Future Oracle, New Monarchy, and Dead Orbit. The faction that saw the most tokens turned in by the community at the end of the week would reward players with a unique weapon. If players pledged to a winning faction for that week, they could buy the unique weapon for only 1,000 Glimmer. Whereas if you didn't pledge to the winning faction, you would have to pay 50,000 Glimmer for the weapon. And keep in mind, in vanilla Destiny 2, getting Glimmer was much harder as there weren't any guaranteed ways to buy it immediately. The issue with this system was that immediately upon release of the event, players would figure out which weapon from the 3 factions was the best, and then the majority of players would pledge to that faction, removing any sort of competition that the event was going for. For quite a while, faction rallies would come into the game every month and nothing would really change. Not to mention, vanilla Destiny 2 had far less variety, which meant there were very few ways to get faction tokens effectively, with lost sectors being the most popular way of farming them. Thankfully, the rewards for the event were updated quite a bit during the Curse of Osiris and Warmind DLCs, as more unique rewards were added to each faction, giving players more of a reason to choose which faction they liked most over which faction had the best gun for that week. Not only that, but during the Warmind DLC, each faction would reward players with a unique exotic catalyst for the Risk Runner, Sunshot, and Graviton Lance, if you were able to max out your rank with them. I believe it was rank 50, correct me if I'm wrong. This was a step in the right direction, as more unique rewards brought this event more in line with what it should have been on release. Faction rallies would continue to take place in Destiny 2 until the end of Season 3, but shortly before the release of the Forsaken expansion in 2018, Bungie would state that faction rallies would be on hiatus to be re-evaluated. Around 2020, Luke Smith, the former Destiny 2 game director, would address the glaring absence of faction rallies and officially announce they were removed from the game, stating, "The reward gear hasn't been used that much, our character cast is growing too large, and crucially, they didn't drive a bunch of engagement with the game." I will say that during the last few faction rallies, they felt in a fairly good spot. Sure, the core activities in Destiny still needed to be improved, but faction rallies started to feel rewarding and worth your time as a Destiny player. So, why did faction rallies fail in Destiny 2? As I mentioned above, for a long time, it was never a competition, and almost every rally would end up in a landslide for either Dead Orbit, New Monarchy, or Future Oracle. Destiny 2 was designed to be a game that would constantly have events and new content being released into the game. Bungie saw how players were starved for activities and content between massive expansions in Destiny 1, and Destiny 2 was built to try and keep players returning to the game every week. Destiny 2 was much more of a live service than Destiny 1 ever was, and faction rallies were a product meant to keep players returning. Destiny 2 also moved away from the box product idea that Destiny 1 was originally founded on, and most likely the reason that factions were changed to become monthly events. Arguably the biggest change to factions that made them fail in Destiny 2 was removing them from being permanent vendors in the tower. The reason they worked so well in Destiny 1 was that they could always be interacted with. Players would get to know every faction in their own time, and you could progress with your faction as quickly or as slowly as you saw fit. This gave every player time to get accustomed to their own faction and build a fondness for each one. Faction rallies disappointed many players when they first released, but they truly started to get better right up to their removal from the game. Unfortunately, the damage was done, and since Forsaken, the factions have been written out of the game in lore, and it would be hard to bring them back narratively. Destiny needs small competition between players, fun rivalries that play into the core of what makes Destiny such a fun game. Nothing made this more important than the mini event in 2019 where players had to choose between giving their allegiance to the Drifter, aka the Gambit vendor, or the Vanguard. This small event showcased what factions did perfectly. It gave people a small bit of player choice and a decision to make. Hope you all enjoyed the video. This was a much more opinionated video than the others that I have made, so I'm curious how many people played the faction rallies, and compared to Destiny 1, how much did you enjoy them? I really do believe that faction rallies were starting to gain their footing right before the release of Forsaken, and if they had just been added permanently to the game, they could have returned to what made them great in Destiny 1. Now I will say nostalgia does affect my opinion on how great factions were in Destiny 1, Especially since Destiny 2 has been out for 6 years now, factions were always something I enjoyed in Destiny 1, and it would be great to see them return. Although I'm certain they won't return since Bungie's focus is purely on seasonal content and the final shape. Anyways, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a good day.